Hi everyone, welcome to Teaching and Learning with Dr. Shweta. Now this is in continuation with the previous video in which I talked about Piaget and Piaget's constructivist theory. So in this video I'll be talking about the stages of Piaget's cognitive development. We've already discussed that Piaget has said two things, that learners are actively creating knowledge and schemas in the mind, and the second thing that he has said is that learning and this development of schema structure in the brain is happening in accordance with the stages of development, the cognitive development. So depending on at which stage of cognitive development the learner is, development proceeds. So the four stages that Piaget has explained, the first one is sensory motor. This stage is during the infancy period, that is 0 to 2, when from being a newborn till the age the child is 2 years old. Now in this stage, the stage of sensory motor development, most of the actions, most of the abilities, now all these abilities are related to cognition, that is the mental development, because the entire theory is based on mental development. So all those abilities, all those tasks are basically being done by reflexes. I'm talking about the very initial stage of this entire period, that is the first month of birth, the first month after birth, and the first 2 months after birth. So most of the actions are, most of the cognitive abilities are done by reflexes that are already present in the child's brain. And in this at this stage, the main cognitive characteristics are that the infant is not displaying very coordinated movements, because he or she lacks coordination, because coordination is a mental thing, it's a brain thing. So this is one specific characteristics of sensory motor developmental stage. Also at this stage, as the child starts moving towards 2 years, that is gradually when the child is 6 months old or 7 months old, language, which is also considered to be a cognitive thing, starts developing. So within the first month you would see the infants using vowels, a, o, these voices and these sounds are produced, and that is the initial, the very first language developmental sign at this stage. And this use of vowels in creating sounds is known as cooing. After cooing, gradually as the baby starts getting 3 months old, then this cooing changes into babbling, where the infant starts using 2 consonants or 2 small words joined together, like baba, dada, mama, all these. So at this stage, the first thing that I discussed was the reflexes. Second, uncoordinated movements. You would see that there is no balance, not much balance visible between the left hand and the right hand, and the left leg and the right leg, and the movements are completely uncoordinated. Everything is reflex controlled and sense controlled. Motor skills are not developed. And language, which is also considered to be a cognitive ability, starts developing, but the only thing that in this period, the beginning of this period, what we witness is cooing and babbling. Gradually, as the child moves towards 6 to 7 months, the words start appearing, and the child's vocabulary gradually starts increasing from few words to 20 words. By the end of 1 year, the child, on an average, the infant knows about 60 to 80 words, and this goes on increasing till the age of 2 years. One thing which is very specific about sensory motor stage is the lack of object permanence. So we all have heard about this this line, out of sight, out of mind. So this happens with infants at this age. In the sensory motor stage, if you show an object to the infant will remember it, will play with it. But as soon as the object disappears from the sight of that baby, the infant will forget about it. So all those toys, they gradually are remembered only after the child attains 2 years of age. It's till 2 years of age, it is in this stage that recognition, remembering and memory is not very sound, and object permanence is not there. So these are the main facets of Piaget's sensory motor stage. I'll just revise. At this stage, the infant stage, there are reflexes that are taking charge of all the actions that the baby is doing. All the actions are sensory controlled based on the sensory experiences. They are uncoordinated. There is no object permanence, and language that develops is just in the form of few words, starting from going to babbling to few words to quite a number of words, about 100 to 120 words at the end of the infancy period. So this was sensory motor of Piaget's theory. The second stage is when the child enters into childhood. The individual enters into childhood, and that stage is known as pre-operational stage. Now in this stage, normally in most of the books you will just see the pre-operational stage, but I have subdivided this stage into pre-conceptual and conceptual, because a lot of books have done that also. They've divided this early childhood into the separate, it includes the middle childhood along with the early childhood. So pre-operational stage, basically it lasts from 3 to 7, but has two divisions of pre-conceptual and conceptual stage, because it is believed that as we move from one stage to another, the ending of one stage starts exhibiting characteristics of the stage which is yet to come. So by the end of 2 years, the individual will start exhibiting characteristics of pre-operational stage. So when the individual is in pre-conceptual stage, it will start showing some characteristics of the next stage. So this is how it begins. These boundaries are not rigid. These boundaries, they always overlap. That is the reason that a lot of books skip these two stages, but I've included these two stages because some also specifically mention these two divisions. So pre-operational stage is the next stage to the infant stage. What happens in this stage? At this stage, the reflexes start getting replaced by intentional actions. Of course, we see that in after the first year also, in the infancy period also, but they become more intentional and knowledge based in this stage. At this stage, the movements are quite coordinated, and you could see that there is a very good visible balance between various limbs of the child. And now the child gains object permanence. Now the child will remember that this is my toy, and even if you keep it out of the sight of the child will remember, and maybe the child will ask for that toy after some time. So object permanence appears at this stage. Now when we talk about pre-conceptual stages, still the child does not have the ability to form concepts or understand concepts. Very few concepts are there that the child begins to understand, and the child has a habit of generalizing everything. Four-legged animal, if a child has been taught that this is a dog and he has 4 legs, then the child will generalize that concept that every 4-legged animal that the child sees is going to be a doggy. So that's how every person who's going to an office, he or she may call that person Papa, because Papa jate hain office. Or every person who's carrying a duster is a teacher. So all these generalization of concepts is what we see in the pre-operational states. So concepts are not very well formed at this stage, but object permanence, language development is far better than the previous stage, which was the sensory motor stage. Now at this stage, the child is very egocentric. Now what is egocentrism? This I'll be taking up after the discussion very elaborately, but here just to mention, egocentrism means the child only understands me, my and myself. The child feels that everything that bothers me should bother the entire world. If I have not got fruits in my evening snacks, then this is a world problem. Everything relates to me. So this kind of feeling, I'll go into details after this video and after this lecture about what egocentrism is, but the child is heavily egocentric at this stage. When we move on to the conceptual stage of the same pre-operational stage, this is the beginning of attainment of concepts, the understanding of concepts, that every 4-legged animal is not a dog. There are many other animals with 4 legs. So every person who's going to office is not my father, is not an officer. So all these concepts, they start beginning to form at the pre-operational stage. But at the stage, the child is still highly egocentric. but has attained all those things all those schemas that were not present during the sensory motor. So these are the main things that Piaget has discussed in the pre-operational stage. When we move to concrete operational, now what is the meaning of the word concrete? Now, whenever I say that, whenever I have to show something to my students, for example, this is a marker. Now, till I don't show this is a marker, if the students are unable to understand what a marker is, this means that their thinking is very concrete. I have to teach them taking into consideration that their thinking is concrete. I cannot let them imagine that the marker is like this, a marker is used. But a child who is a little elder than this age, maybe a 12 or a 13-year-old child, will be easily able to imagine how a marker is, imagine a situation. So these are complex cognitive abilities, are what a child at this stage cannot do. Everything has to be shown, has to be concretely presented to the child in order to understand. So at this stage, although the concepts are forming, because in the previous stage they were already forming, but despite of that, a lot of thinking is still concrete. But what the child has mastered at this age, all that was not mastered in these previous two stages. That is, the child is now less egocentric. The child now understands that if I am getting a chance to sit on the first seat in the class, then next day someone else will get a chance to sit on it. It's not that I am going to sit on it every day. It's not just my thing. It's the child learns to logically think, and this is what is special about concrete operational. Now, when the child moves to the next stage, here the formal operational stage, here starts from concrete, we move to abstract thinking. Now we can give situations to the child where imagination, reasoning, and all these abilities can be made use to, because now the child is able to imagine and solve problems. At this stage, the thinking was still concrete. At this stage, the thinking has become abstract. So all these difficult situations, abstract thinking, reasoning, deduction, that can be done at this stage, and this continues till adulthood. These kind of concepts, they keep forming till adulthood. So these are the main characteristics that Piaget has tried to include in the stages of cognitive development he talks about. I'll just revise quickly. At the sensory motor stage, the main points that he has developed: uncoordinated movements, reflexes. Most of the understanding is through senses, through touch, through taste, and that is how the child is learning. And at this stage, cooing, babbling, and then gradually number of words increase, vocabulary increase, and language acquisition takes place till 2 years. And what else? Object permanence is missing at this stage. In the next stage, object permanence, here if we are talking about this subpart of this stage, here there is no concept formation yet. The concepts are not very clear. The child is generalizing all the concepts, but object permanence has decreased. But the child is very egocentric and only thinking about himself or herself and imagining that the entire world revolves around my problems. At this stage, the child, I forgot to mention that, starts to learn to write and read, because language acquisition becomes very fast and better. But concepts start forming when this stage is ending. So that is the reason I have divided this into two parts. So towards the end of 7 years, the child will be able to classify and distinguish between various objects. And again, classification, distinguishing, recognition, all these things are cognitive abilities. And that is why this entire theory is only talking about cognitive abilities and not talking about socialization, friendships, or things like that. So we are only focusing on mental abilities in this theory. So as the child now moves to the next stage, a lot of concepts are now better, because the child has crossed the conceptual stage. The child is now less egocentric. The child, however, cannot do very complex operations. Still, the thinking is very concrete. So although the child has now started thinking logically, object permanence is acquired, egocentrism has reduced, language has become better than the previous stages. Now the child is performing is able to recite a poem, or is able to speak fluently, but still a lot of complex cognitive actions are not possible, because they are possible only in the next stage, which is the formal operational stage. The formal operational stage is from 12 to 18 years, and at this stage it is possible for the individual to do complex logical operations, deductive and inductive reasoning. The individual now has a better understanding of the world, the concepts are well formed, and this is how the cognitive development proceeds from 0 to 18. Now, as I mentioned during this video, that I'll be taking up two things: egocentrism, and there's one more concept that I feel is very important for us to understand. That concept is conservation. So let's just understand what these two concepts are. Well, the three things that we discussed in this video. First was, now this is important from your seated point of view. These all terms are often asked, what do you mean by this? So it's important to discuss that separately. Object permanence, egocentrism, and the third is conservation. I'll give you examples for all three. Object permanence, as I already discussed, if something is before your eyes, you remember that. As soon as it disappears, it's kept somewhere, you forget about it. So that happens in the infancy period, that out of sight, out of mind. The child would forget about the toy if it is not in presence of the toy. But this object permanence, the absence of object permanence is there only in the beginning, in the earlier initial months of after birth. It gradually decreases. So that we have discussed. Egocentrism. Now, egocentrism, you can remember this with the word ego, although it does not have much to do with the ego that we generally use in layman language. Egocentrism means something that has to do with myself. So children are self-centered. They are usually only thinking about their problems. They believe that the entire world revolves around their problems, which may be very small, which may be very trivial, like, just as not getting a snack on time, or the teacher not appreciating my work, or not giving me a star in my homework, and the child breaks down, the child gets cranky. So all that, self-centeredism is something unique to childhood, and that gradually decreases as the child moves from the pre-conceptual to conceptual phase, and then finally when enters the second last stage, that is the concrete operational, it finally reduces. Now the next topic that I did not discuss while making the video was conservation. What do we mean by conservation? I'll just give you an example. Suppose we have a glass of water, or maybe a glass of juice, and it's full till here, and it's a favorite juice for a child. Suppose the child is about 6 years of age. Now if I transfer this content to a wider flask, of course it will look like this, but the child who's 6-year-old will assume that this quantity has reduced, that it was not conserved, it was wasted. So this means there is lack of conservation. So when the child is till 6 to 7 years, conservation abilities are not present. Conservation, the sense of conservation develops only once the child crosses the 7 years of age. That is when the child enters into the second last stage, which is the pre-operational stage. So this I'll give you another example. If there is a foil, and if we just fold the foil and make it into a ball, the child will assume that this has reduced. You take a bar of chocolate and you break it into pieces, and then you make a small ball out of it. The child will refuse to accept it. The child will think that a 6-year-old child, a 5-year-old child, a 4-year-old child will refuse to accept it, because the child will think that it has reduced in quantity. This means that the sense of conservation is not developed. So this is one more point that I wanted to discuss separately, and these are very important when we discuss the Piaget's stages of development. So just summing up in one line, Piaget says that we are constantly building our schemas as we grow from the infancy period to the adulthood, and that is happening naturally. The child is an active learner and is actively constructing this network of schemas. Now, how this happens, this has a pattern, and there are stages of cognitive development in accordance to which these schemas develop. These schemas will not develop haphazardly. A schema of abstract reasoning, as we discussed, will happen at the last stage, the formal operational stage. It will not happen in the infancy stage. So there is an order in which cognitive development takes place. That order has been given by Piaget as the stages of cognitive development. Now, why we are using the word cognitive? Because we are only discussing the cognitive abilities in this theory. We are not discussing the social abilities, the emotional abilities, and all that has not been discussed by Piaget, which in the later videos we will take up as limitations of Piaget. But then Piaget has contributed wonderfully to this area of cognitive development by giving this theory. It's extremely useful to us as teachers when we make curriculum, when we decide what has to be given at what age for cognitive development of the students. So this is a wonderful theory. So summing it up, the first stage is infancy period, where we don't see much of action that is not related to reflexes. Most of the actions are reflex based. There is lack of coordination, there is lack of object permanence. Of course, conservation is not there at all, and speech is just developing from cooing to babbling, all that. And then we move on to the childhood period, the pre-conceptual period, and the period where the pre-operational period, where the child is developing. The child is still not having conservation. The child is extremely egocentric, but the child has acquired object permanence. The child has acquired language abilities. And as we move on to the third stage, the language is well developed. Egocentrism has decreased. The child has started thinking logically, but still is at the concrete operational stage and still needs a lot of audio, video, and evidences to be shown, because imagination is not that well developed at this stage. And at the last stage, the formal operation stage that we discussed, that conservation has been totally mastered, egocentrism has decreased, and the child is now able to do complex logical operations using proper reasoning. So this was what I wanted to discuss in the Piaget stages of cognitive development. Thank you.